Hi, today I want to talk about status ailments in Arknights, because every time that someone brings up the fact that most bosses are immune to most statuses as a way to discredit status ailments as a whole, a small African child dies. Not just that, there's also the extension of this argument where the person making it seems to be convinced that most enemies are immune to most statuses, when this is just not true. Elites and mobs are vastly not immune to status ailments. But where does this belief come from? Usually, when there's a widespread misconception in the fanbase, it's the fault of one of three groups of people. The first is content creators, the second is the elite upper echelon competitive esport Fuji Cup players, which know so much about the game and are so mechanically skilled that they end up losing touch with the average player experience and don't realize that their extreme high-level D18 IS6 ending 245 run is not exactly the average player experience. Finally, the last group is the casuals, which don't really engage with the game beyond a surface level, and thus think they know what's up based on this surface level experience. This time, it's the fault of the casuals. Because when you go through an event, or just any main story stage, or any normal content, quote-unquote, what you have to give a fuck about is the boss. You don't give a shit about any of these guys here, they are fodder, with few exceptions in few events. As a casual, what you're threatened by, what you have to care about, and what your attention is therefore centralized on is the boss, and therefore the only thing that ends up mattering is the boss, because everyone else is not really a threat outside of some few circumstances. So, since a lot of the bosses are immune to most of the statuses, that can create an idea that therefore the important enemies are immune to statuses and therefore statuses are useless. This is very common in gaming in general, because it turns out that the developers don't really like to give the player an option to instantly shut down the boss on a moment's notice, and so usually status ailments are in the middle ground, where they're useless against mobs, because the mobs die quick anyway, but also useless against the bosses, because the bosses are immune. You can easily notice this in JRPGs, for example. However, Arknights avoids this issue, and I don't think a lot of you are aware of it. But okay, SUPAH, how is it then that Arknights manages this? What is the secret sauce behind sidestepping this incredibly common issue in all of gaming? I'm glad you asked, dear viewer. Let me point your attention to something. Here is an IS6 run. You will notice, look at the enemies you are fighting throughout pretty much all of an IS run. You will notice that there is a theme, even if the enemies can get quite tough because of the buffs, and so you may not really realize it, but the vast majority of things you are fighting in IS are basic mobs and elite enemies. You really don't fight a lot of bosses, and because of the IS modifiers, they are real, actual threats. Not just that, we also have CC. Let me bring your attention to the fact that in CC as well, you are mainly fighting mobs and elite enemies. So, what have we established so far? We have established that it's a misconception that the vast majority of enemies in the game are immune to statuses because common mobs and even elites are weak to most statuses, and we have established that in the two main game modes for the game, you mostly fight mobs and elite enemies. So immediately we can tell that in this kind of environment, statuses are very valuable. In fact, this brings me to the operator who I will mainly discuss today, and that is Gnosis. Because yes, I have a Crownslayer in the thumbnail, and the Crownslayer is one of the operators that get overlooked because she's tied to a status. But the real victim, I feel like, is Nosis. No one gives a fuck about this guy, but he's so fucking good. Not only does he have the highest fragile percentage in the game, if I'm not mistaken, he's also just really good at applying freeze, and it turns out that freeze is really good. Not just that, they also gave him a quite bonkers IS module. In IS, when Nosis is on the field, enemies inflicted with Cold or Frozen take 50% of Nosis's attack as arts damage every half a second. Not just that, all attacks just inflict cold for 1 second, and in integrated strategies when on the field, he applies 30% fragile to all cold enemies. Frozen enemies receive double the fragile, and they continue taking more fragile the longer they are frozen, up to a maximum of 80%. Not just that, every other Kjerag operator also inflicts cold with every skill activation to the enemies in range. So let's put all the puzzle pieces together. We know that in the main modes of the game you fight mobs and elite enemies. We know that is true especially in IS. We know that he has a busted ass IS module, and we know that there is a Kjerag shaped limited half anniversary banner with two of the strongest units in the game in it. Gnosis has gained so much value as an operator in Year 7, it's kind of absurd. He's insanely good. Look at this fucking IS-6 ending 4 footage. I don't know what the fuck happened here. I don't know what fucking relics caused this. Honestly, IS-6 is kind of a mess now, but Jesus Christ. So you have an operator that can perma-freeze, that gives the highest fragile effect in the game, that he himself is a really good sub-DPS, and that in IS is probably the highest value supporter voucher, even above Tragodia. But that's not just Gnosis. Statuses in general are good in this game. I have a whole video on Crownslayer. You can watch that for more in-depth explanation. But the short of it is that her stun is just really versatile and really useful because it lasts a long time, it has great uptime, and the stun completely disables the enemy. It doesn't just stop them from moving, and that is more useful than you'd think. Just ignore the damage graph. It turns out the bot I was using was heavily favoring Crownslayer because it gave the total damage against 3 enemies for some fucking reason instead of 1. But okay, if you're a perspicacious viewer, if you're a very dedicated hater who's very familiar with the SUPAH lore, I'm sure there's something that you're thinking right now that's bouncing in your little noggin, and that is, SUPAH, if statuses are strong, and you were kind of incorrect back in 2023 to dismiss them, isn't there an operator you should owe an apology to? Shouldn't we have the I was wrong about Ashe video? And no. Ashe is still ass, but it's not because stun is ass, it's because the way she uses stun is ass. So, for those of you who are not caught up to speed, on a deployment, Ashe throws a little flashbang that stuns enemies for 6 seconds with the module, and skill 2 is her main skill. What this skill does is that it immediately tosses out another flashbang. She starts blasting with the assault rifle, and she deals a bunch of damage to stunned targets. Now, why is this bad? Because you fight mostly mobs and elites, as I've been saying, so wouldn't this be useful in IS? Wouldn't this be useful in CC? Well, here's the issue. The issue is that the way that Ashe is designed, she's not really making use of stun as crowd control in the same way that Crownslayer is. Ashe is using stun as a conditional. Stun in this kit is an obstacle between Ashe and her damage. So, whereas an operator like Crownslayer entirely revolves around stun as crowd control and can greatly benefit from it, Ashe is only harmed by her stun, because it means she can't really burst down bosses, and the mobs and elites, you'd rather use a more reliable damage dealer. What I'm saying is that Ashe uses her stun as damage dealing instead of crowd control, and that obviously falls apart. Given there are situations where this is useful, because even if this kit is all ass backwards, stun is still stun, and stun is good, and she does deal pretty decent damage. So there are stages, especially in the Sniper Knight's niche, where Ashe is useful. Let's not forget CCB2, which feels almost tailor-made for her. But okay, Soup Boy, does this then mean that every status is good? Not really. Because there's the statuses that everyone knows are good instinctively, like Lure, that Tragodia has, or Paralysis, that Tragodia has. You may be noticing a pattern here. And that's because even most bosses are not immune to those. And for some reason, Hypergriff just refuses to make bosses which are immune. But no, even with all I've stated here, there's still some status ailments which are kind of booty cheeks. First and foremost, sleep. I have the video on Titi, which you can watch for a more detailed explanation on why sleep is ass, but the main point is that sleep is just stun, but strictly worse, because in tower defense games like this, crowd control acts as a damage multiplier. Very simply, if you have an enemy in the range of your damage dealer for a longer time, that means your damage dealer got to deal more damage. With sleep, you can't do this, because your operators can't attack enemies which are sleeped. Therefore, it means that you can't use sleep for the one main purpose of crowd control in a tower defense game. Then there's Levitate, which is kind of a meme, honestly, and that's not because it is inherently fundamentally flawed like sleep, but rather because there's not really any good Levitate operator yet. All we have right now is Holheyak in IS, which saw use once in IS-6 and in 5 as a weird strategy to nuke the map with Angelina, and Angelina herself, still in IS. Beside those two, there's no good Levitate applicator. Except, of course, for Haruka's skill tree, because Haruka's skill tree was the first one to realize that Levitate can be used defensively, and not just as a conditional for damage like Irene, which has the same issue as Ash. So while it's not fundamentally flawed like Sleep, we just don't have any good Levitate operator yet. So what's my final point with this? Max out your Gnosis and max out your Crownslayer. That's all, goodbye. Hi, hello there, welcome to the outro. I'll keep it brief this time. I'm a busy man, I have places to be. I'm not here to dilly-dally. Thank you for watching and thank you to the members. In particular, Dr. Mom Hunter, Patan, Vananeko, Mr. Ler, Eframn, Mr. Lazy Lemon, Bartu2X, Camilo Wishal, Viper Sushi, Lozu, NegPXL, Francisco Nunez, Solarlight Era, Yuzu Ocha, Alclane, Noel Runes, Kindred 2, Lizard King, Ascended Azen, Nemotics, Roman Slink, Lone Chef, Gingentuna, Ilio, Living Shadow, Green Box, Divius, Bomb Ninja, Politic, UX102, Tajana Raptor, Saint Shin Jago, Never Farov, Phoenix, Snoop, I Want Free Money, Borubarf, Bellisist 1, Nebigo, Selfer 7, Shiro Dezu, Balancing Peppers, Chakalvares, Sebistam, San Kenshi, Kromala-chan, 5 QDZK, Genius Gay Shipper, Camon Hiran, Larmendra, Yovune, King of Harems, and the guy with 2 names. That's all, bye bye, less than a minute, sub 1 minute.